Right, hello guys, I am back with another update to my continued army progression, plus today also a couple of other bits. Now, if you're new to this series, I have several other episodes uploaded already. There's a playlist on the main channel page called Painting and Modelling, where you can find all the army update series so far, as well as some other things. Although I still have much more to add to this series as it's ongoing. Now this is going to be a longer video than usual, as I have in fact two entire forces to overview today, plus some product overviews, plus my homebrew Necron lore in brief. And usually when I do these updates, it's just going to be a couple of miniatures as I've done before. It's basically a showcase of what I have been painting up, with perhaps a little discussion of process as well. But today I'm showing off the entire Space Marines Indomitus force and the entire Necron force, and then still, like I say, a couple of others. Now in between everything else I've been doing, it has taken me several months to get the Space Marines from Indomitus completed, because it's quite a lot of models, and they were greatly enjoyable to paint, but it definitely was a challenge, and I think I did learn a few things, as you usually should when you're painting some 24 miniatures. But the main thing with the Indomitus Marines is that they're considerably detailed as a force to paint. You have the 10 Assault Marines, which are quite basic, but even these have slightly different shoulder pads and other minor details to look at comparative to standard Primaris or even Firstborn Marines, and those small details add up and add to the time it takes to get it all done. Then you had the Eradicators, which I wasn't particularly looking forward to because they remind me of aggressors, and I remember how much of a chore painting Space Marine aggressors was. But in actuality, they were quite straightforward. The Outrider squad on the bikes were not too bad to paint, although the connecting join on the top of the bike has been the bane of hobbyists. It is an especially bad mold connection, and in the most visible place as well. So leveling that surface with putty as well was very important, and I did it as well as I could do. And then when you come to the rest of the force, it is near enough character levels of detail. The Blade Guard squad of 3 are almost each a character really, and it has renewed my dislike of painting shields, because shields are always fiddly as hell, and it didn't help that I also had the Victrix Honor Guard to just finish off, as they'd been neglected for some time. I wanted to get those done, which meant even more shields to paint up. So in total with the Indomitus force and the Victrix, I think I had like 7 shields to paint, including the Captain, which has the very complex shield. So yeah, there's a lot of shield action. It's been a long time since I've painted any chaplains for the army as well, and so this meant painting up 2 Marines with the black armor style, because you've got the Judicia or whatever and the chaplain there. So although I was actually very pleased with how these guys turned out, when choosing a Space Marine army, it might be worth noting that black armor is going to be a fairly basic army when it comes to painting, because you can near enough spray them black, do a grey highlight, and maybe just wash those highlights with a thinned blue contrast paint, and basically you're done. Now you can make it more complicated than that, which I did, but if you want to do it very basic, that's all you got to do. Probably one of the quicker color choices for a Space Marine army, to be honest. Probably the other most simple is going to be any army that is silver, because you can just basically prime it black, dry brush silver or airbrush silver, and you're pretty much done. In terms of painting though, like I say, I felt like I got quite a lot out of the Indomitus Marine set. It definitely helped me feel even more confident about the painting scheme that I've developed for my Ultramarines, and just as a side note, I will be including painting recipes from here on via my Patreon, but with the fairly big caveat that they will be freely available. In fact, as I've said before in a YouTube community post, I greatly appreciate the support that people give to me and the channel via Patreon, but any content that I add there for 40k painting or modelling in general, it's not going to be paywalled. It's my hope that, as always, people will support me there just because they want to support overall, not for specific paywalled rewards. Now, there were many details across the Indomitus Marines that set them apart from earlier Primaris. Now, notably their shields, but also an increase in purity seals and scroll work, their various trophies and rosaries, the use of dead Astarte skeletons as wards. And this reminds us of how various elements within the Imperium can use the bones and skulls of their dead heroes to give them protection because of the fallen warriors' spiritual purity. Many in the Ecclesiarchy, they will do this. Most obviously, it's something that the Grey Knights use, although you'll see various Space Marines also just carrying bones as special relics and so on. It's reminiscent of the Grey Knight's bone shard of Solor. This bleached relic was actually carved from the thigh bone of brother Captain Solor, and it was actually used as a stake to slay the bloodthirster Commander, the Shard has ever since been the bane of beasts, especially those dedicated to the blood god of Khorne, who will always recoil from its presence. When the veil between the warp and reality grows thin, the bone begins to vibrate, and this is the ancient essence of Solor himself reacting to the presence and remnants of demons, and will serve to protect its bearer from the horrors of the warp. We now see this kind of relic similarly fashioned with the Primaris of the Indomitus Crusade, carrying not just single bones, but in fact entire skeletons of Astartes, and we know them to be Astartes because it's logical and also the connection plugs on the bones themselves. So it's clear that the Primaris have, as we well know by now, been persuaded into adopting much of the ceremony and rituals of the firstborn Marines and the spirituality of the ecclesiarchy. They use the bones of dead Marines to protect themselves, and understanding that there is some power within them and that this will actively aid them against the enemies of mankind. So they're not so fresh out of the gate at this point. They've been around the block, they know what's up, and they have learned about the realities of the wider Imperium and just what humanity is facing. Now, another thing in this Indomitus set that we see is the curious return of the Volkite weapons, in the Primaris Lieutenant wielding his Neo-Volkite pistol. Now, for me, this highlights the struggling annoyance that I always talk about when it comes to the lore, because it helps to underline my point that things are only set until they are not. Up until now, the Imperium was incapable of crafting Volkite weapons because they were seen as too advanced compared to when the earlier period during the Crusade of the Emperor, when Volkites were actually quite commonplace. But then over time, they sort of went out of use. They were more refined, more a fashioned version of what would later become kind of melter weapons and so on. Yet now the Imperium is moving forward again, and so somehow we have seen the return of Volkite weapons, and of course this is to do with Belisarius Cawl. There is of course the captain for the Indomitus force, and he's featuring this amazing relic shield as well. It adds a whole level of detail to the character, and it did increase the time which it took for me to paint him, not to mention the wrapped scrolls and prayer parchment around his arm behind, which I detailed scripture on. I also did a purple blended power sword for him, which turned out I think pretty well. I decided not to go with the head styled where it has the raised faceplate. I think many people did this, but I really didn't like that style personally. You may know also at the base of the captain's feet, not a Necron as featured in the original model, but instead I put a pile of Tau skulls there, because I just thought it was more appropriate, and it makes me feel much happier of course. Now, another character I want to make note of here was the Judicia. Now, I have seen an exhaustive amount of people doing head swaps for this character on Instagram and Twitter. Oh look, you used the skull head from the Reaver squad. How original. Now, for some reason, people really didn't like the stock head for the Judicia, but I think that was mainly because of how it was painted in the original Games Workshop artwork. It had this pale, ghost-like skin and red eyes, but she ended up looking more like Uncle Fester from the Addams Family. So I can't really blame people for thinking it didn't look quite right. But I actually liked the fact that it seemed like it has a mask. Literally, if you look at it, it's actually pinned over the face. And it reminded me much more of the Humongous from Mad Max 2. It made me think that this character has some horribly scarred face beneath. So I went for a much darker, shadowed face of the Judicia. Much more imposing and sort of terrifying really. And then I styled the rear section of the head with like red veins and scarring to make it look as if the facial mask was there to cover some horror underneath. And I think it turned out really well. I was glad I kept the stock head on the character, and I tried to make it work. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that in the comments below. One big question though that I found for myself with this set of Indomitus Marines was when it came to the Assault Squad. And it is of course the question that so many people have already asked: why did they choose not to give an option for jump packs? Now, Assault Marines have always traditionally had powered jump packs, which enable them to drop out of the skies right into the middle of battle. It gives them this ability to take huge leaps across the battlefield over friendlies, to get in and behind an enemy, to basically sort of do pincer movements and trap others to slaughter them, which is what you want for a unit that is primarily focused on close quarter fighting. Now, it could of course be to do with the fact that the Primaris Assaults have a heavy bolt pistol compared to the normal Assault Marines standard bolt pistol. This gives them more range, more armor penetration. They do still look really great in their poses, but I just think it is a shame that we haven't had jump pack options. Overall, I really enjoyed completing the Indomitus Force, even though it was a bit of a slog. The bikes do look especially good, and I picked up the Chaplain as well, which is now on my to-do list. The bikes are actually pretty straightforward to paint, and if I didn't have the entire rest of the force to complete, they probably could have been finished over one weekend. The poses and looks on these guys is really great, and I was pretty pleased with how they turned out. especially with the Sergeant's head, which I think managed to get painted very nice and cleanly. It's probably one of the better faces that I've painted, and this is another thing I definitely feel more confident with now, because faces on any models in Warhammer or anything really were for a long time a real fear. It's very difficult to paint faces. But again, the Siege Studios course really did help, not to necessarily give me specific methods to follow, although they do that, but it was much more about helping me to frame my thinking on how to tackle faces. And now I just grab some colours and I can do a face with a simple brush in a very short space of time. It's become much easier, I don't fear doing it anymore, and it's become very comfortable. Now I want to say, before we finish talking about the Marines, I wanted to make mention about the so-called Monopose style of these miniatures, because I've seen a lot of people sort of talk about this. Now this is something which is nearly always talked about negatively. And what this refers to, for those of you who don't know, is that in the past most 40k models, although very much not all, had the ability to adapt the pose for your minis, like with your arms and weapons, that was supplied with a smoother connection point. This meant that you could move those arms and weapons and so on, you could move them around to give your character more of a pose, or more of a unique position for them. Now more recently, and it is usually just the boxed sets and not the latest separate boxes that they release, Games Workshop have been creating miniatures with connection points on them, and this makes them essentially push fit. And this means that the arms and heads are basically locked into a specific pose. You push the pieces together and that's how they are. Now some people have been very unhappy about this. Myself, personally, I don't really feel like it's a big deal. And if you really want to, you can just cut off the connection insert. You might need to add a touch of green stuff and shave a bit of plastic to get an arm or whatever to sit exactly how you want, and then you're good to go. It's really not a big deal. Now, I would note, for example, that I was able to, with not much effort, repose my Calgar, which is a 100% monopose Marine. It's like a set, but I just kind of cut some of the plastic, reassembled it slightly, and it was fine. It only took me a fairly minor amount of tweaking. I reposed him. So if you wanted to do this on standard infantry, it would be really pretty easy. But to go further, I actually quite like this style of miniature with the push fit connectors. And you're probably thinking, whoa, that's mad, Luton. And it's like, okay, listen, the simple reason is, it makes them considerably easier to paint. I'll also say in the past, I've even had sets that were meant to give you options for posing your miniatures, and it really didn't give you that many choices. Usually the arms and heads, etc., they were relatively static. They did look different, but they were quite static. They had more options for you, I guess. Maybe that's what it is that people are worried about. They want to have more options, but usually you do get more options in the separately released sets. But if you really want to make your miniatures look unique and individual, you're going to have to do some proper kit bashing conversions, not just slightly repose them. The way these monopose Marines fit together, like I said though, means you're able to move them around very easily and without glue. You can move the arm a little bit whilst it's sitting on there. You can take the arm off, you can put it back on. You can assemble and disassemble your minis throughout the painting process, instead of just doing sub-assembly, final assembly. You know, you can take them off and, like I say, sort of move them around and stuff, which I found to be incredibly useful. Now, how useful that's going to be is going to slightly depend on how you paint. If you're just a straight brush painter, then maybe you don't find that too useful. But for me, for example, I like to have some airbrushing in there. So I'll do a couple of stages where I do airbrushing, then I might want to take those pieces out, paint them separately, put them back together, do a varnish airbrush pass, take those pieces off, and so it's very helpful for me to be able to kind of put those on and off as you go along. And these days I often do sub-assembly painting because I want my models to look as complete as they can, even if it's in a very hard to reach space. I sleep better knowing that I got that bit painted, and comparative to the hassle I usually have to go through, doing it with these push fit sets was considerably easier. Now, quite honestly, if I were given the choice of having these when weighing up all the options, I probably would go for these every time. I do get that you might not have so much compatibility, or you might not have so much range of choice with weapons and arm units and so on, and it's like, yeah, okay, I get that. But so long as it's not like every single model, or maybe there's some alternative elements in there, even just a few choices or something, I'd be fine with that. Now overall though, in terms of painting, my force of Ultramarines Indomitus, and I'll just say if you want to find out why my army is Ultramarines, I do have a video speaking specifically about that, and I'll link that at the end of this video. But this force, I would say in terms of me painting it, was time consuming, but also relatively straightforward. Now I have definitely got my recipe for the Ultras down now, and I was able to work through them better because of that. But one thing though that occurred to me was just how long painting up Space Marines takes, for me anyway. Because for as plain as they look, for me to get them finished, there's a lot of steps. You got to assemble, you got to prime, base coat, layer paint, decals, more detailing, spot shading, more details, varnish, highlighting, weathering, and then the basing. It's a lot of stuff to do. Now, doing that across every single Marine for the entire force is not that quick unless you're spending every day on it and you are maybe a professional painter and you're very good at just smashing through stuff. And to be honest, I worry a little to think about how long this force actually took me to complete, because it easily has to be well over 100 hours, albeit dotted across the past 2 months. Still though, it was easily worth it because I am very happy with the results, and I think soon I need to do for you guys again another complete overview of just where we are with the Space Marine army. Coming up next, I still have got some more Primaris to do. I've got a Thunderhawk, a Falchion destroyer tank. I also have various other vehicles and Firstborn Marines. And just talking about Thunderhawk and the Destroyer, I'm very much looking forward to the next Imperial Armor book, which is very soon, because we need to know those points. We need to know whether they've changed any of the stats in those units. So I'm very excited when we can eventually get a look at that. Now, as I say though, painting the Indomitus force, it was a long road, but it was very satisfying. Just like any 40k minis, completing it gives you a real sense of satisfaction and completion. So having got those checked off my list now feels really good, and it's meant I've jumped straight into some other things to take a break from painting miniatures. Now within the force though, my favourite models are definitely the Lieutenant, the Chaplain, and the Blade Guard Sergeant. The Lieutenant just had an overall feel that was really good. It's hard to be more specific than that, but I think it's a combination of the pose, the Volkite pistol, the Lieutenant's markings for the helmet, and the colour combinations. It just felt a very aesthetically pleasing addition to the army. The Chaplain was one of few that I've tried to improve my painting game when it came to highlighting black armour correctly. And that is with increasingly bright highlights from a dull grey blue up to a near white, and then adding a blue glaze of thinned contrast to give you the highlight tint. And then this is combined with me feeling quite happy about the face that I'd done and the scrolls around the Chaplain. Then lastly we have the Blade Guard Veteran Sergeant. Now this was again just a strong looking model. The red and white helmet for the Veteran Sergeants is always a good look, and it's just a really strong pose. So I really enjoyed how this guy turned out as well. I did also have my Ultramarines Victrix Honor Guard, which I've been meaning to finish for, as I said, quite some time. These guys are on bases again, featuring the skulls of Xenos Tau, and simply I was just very happy with how they turned out. And probably the main thing you might notice here is that I've been leaning toward doing purple for my capes and special leather work on the Ultramarines, because I just think it looks more regal and higher status than the red, which is commonly used for these kind of details. Again, happy to have finished them, happy with how they turned out, especially when they're going to be accompanying Calgar or Guilliman. So in terms of my Ultramarines, I guess one other thing that I'll just say is that I continue painting them in this colour scheme, which you might notice is a little different than most Ultramarines you tend to see these days. And that is because I had to colour match my older Marines in the army. And soon I'm going to have to, like I said, get all those out to showcase just how the force is looking. Because as you can see with these Ultramarines, I've painted them with a classic 1990s bright yellow shoulder trim. But many of the weapons are painted black in line with the modern style of Ultramarine. Now this is because I do not want my Ultramarines to completely be a retro style. I don't want them to have goblin green bases, I don't want them to have red guns. You will see some red guns, but those are usually reserved for the absolute veterans in my force. Because my Ultramarines army is not meant to be a hardcore retro army. What it's meant to be is a nod to the past style and a nod to how long I've been doing this stuff. So by keeping that yellow trim but not going all the way in on everything, I just want it to be more of a historical accent on the army than a completely retro force. I think it's been working really well so far, and also I do still need to go back and tweak some of those older models. You remember when I did my first video a while ago about the force in general, what I wanted to do and what I wanted to try and achieve, so that's where I've come down on. I want to give them a little tweak. I don't plan on completely repainting the old force, stripping and repainting. I don't want to do that. I think you can achieve a lot by just touching up some of the very messy miniatures here and there, just going in with a little contrast paint to give some refinement, just tidying up some of the connections, doing some of the recesses and spot shading and things like that. Just going in and doing those little details will help a lot, add some weathering here and there, things like this. And then on top of that, I want to try and preserve at least one or two of the squads so I can compare my painting progression. This feels more important to me now than it did previously, because now my Ultramarines and just the general painting in 40k, it's become more like a kind of personal achievement journey in terms of skilling up my painting. So I want to be able to look back, and like I say, when I first got the force out, the first thing I wanted to do was just smash through, repaint it. But now I definitely feel like, no, you know, I want to be able to look back and appreciate, oh look, this is where my painting was. And I don't think I really appreciated that when I first started like a year or two ago, really hard getting back into painting. So I'm glad that I didn't kind of jump the gun and just start repainting all that stuff. I'm very glad that I have those now. I can try and preserve that. I don't want to keep the worst of the worst, but I definitely want to have some that I can look back and go, hey look, yeah, this is where these guys were at. Overall though, the force is moving forward, and I think quite scary, it now probably comes in somewhere around 10,000 points. I think it could easily be more than that. I still got plenty to build and paint to add to the force as well, but my Ultras army right now, it's basically a massive force. I think soon enough I could draw a line under it though and say, okay, enough, perhaps come back to it at a later date. It's just been an accumulating thing for decades now, and it's kind of really getting to a point where I have to say, okay, enough is enough. Now that's because I also have got 2 new Imperium forces that I want to be working on, as well as the Necron, which I'll come to momentarily. But first, okay, let's talk about metallics that I used on this Indomitus force. So along with the Indomitus box, I've been lucky to be sent along some paints courtesy of Exit23Games, who work with the Turbodork brand of paints. Now they carry their whole range of pearlescent paints, and those are paints which are basically a twin tone effect where the colour will alter in the light, as well as their fully extensive metallic range. Now when it comes to the Turbodork paints that I was sent, they sent me a really good range of metallics and a few of the pearlescent style. Now today I'll be looking primarily at the metallics, because I had a good range of golds, silvers, copper and bronze colours that they sent. Now after testing through them, I found a few combinations that I enjoyed, and that's what I want to show you here. Now first up, to create the general gold chest plates on my Indomitus Marines as well as the other gold detailing, I used a combination of Death By, which is a darker bronze metallic, then I layered Gold Rush, and then I applied some washes of Agrax and Rakeland to help give some shading and a more gold tone, before then highlighting them with a well-mixed ill-gotten gold to help pick out those details. Now the results I think look very good, as you can see from the finished models. In terms of coverage, both Death By and Gold Rush cover very well. Ill-gotten gold was a little bit more difficult, but as I said, when it's mixed well and you can use it just to pick up those highlights, it did absolutely fine. It was a colour that I wanted to get there. And next I wanted to mention that I did use some other metal elements on some detailing, like on the chaplain for example, the buckles, the rosaries, also some of the silver detailing I did on weapons and so on. Now for this I used a mixture of, again, the Death By bronze colour and then cartridge family, 2 cents. Sometimes I used a bit of Gold Rush on top of that for picking out detail. I also used the 6 shooter on the silvers, and then Tin Star, which I actually forgot to film here on this highlight of the carousel. Now the coverage of these also was very fine, except for 2 cents. Now 2 cents had very good coverage. In fact, this will probably be one of my default copper paints from here on, because this is a very nice paint. It really covers well, and I was super impressed with that. Now they also sent me some niche metallic colours, and these are likely not going to have too much common use, but I did find ways to get them onto the models. You have Multipass, Red Rum and Seafood. Now Multipass is something like a copper orange bright. It's quite granular as well in nature, and it needs some decent mixing and then a couple of layers. It's too bright for this force, but may well find its way into my Necron army or my Necromunda gang, which does have an orange theme, so I did like that paint. Then you got Red Rum, basically a rich metallic red. Very nice paint to use, got decent coverage. I used this on one of the sword sheaths, and as you can see, really nice finish. Then Seafood. Now this is an interesting blue-green mix. Covers also well. I used it in combination with a thinned blue contrast paint to create the colour for my Judicia's sword. I also mixed in some of the Seafood with Tin Star paint, the silver, 1-to-1, to then go back in and pull some highlights on the sword edges. Lastly, do I have any negatives about the Turbodork paint? Not really in terms of the paint themselves. As I've said, they've got some interesting colours. The metallics definitely worth looking at. The pearlescent paints, I'll try to showcase those another time, but they're also not without their uses depending on the kind of force you want to do, especially if you're doing something like a Necromunda gang or Xenos, which are a bit more out there in their colours, or I suppose also Necron. You could take one of those pearlescent paints and do your entire Necron force in that if you wished. Now if you enjoy trying out new paints, I would definitely give them a go. Like I said, the coverage is mixed like it is with most brands of metallic paint. I have not found a single metallic brand or range of paints which covers well across the board. There's always some which are hit and miss. That just seems to be how it goes. My one nitpick with the Turbodork stuff is the bottles, specifically the caps. Now the bottles themselves are just about fine. Many of their bottles also come with a metal or glass bead already inside to help you shake up the paint and get it well mixed, and that's really nice. Not all paints have that. In fact, pretty much most of them don't have that. You can of course buy glass or metal beads to go into your paints to shake them up and help mix. You can do that with anything. But the issue here with the Turbodork paints, it's the cap. This is the main thing. They're just a bit flimsy. And so one of them had actually split near enough as soon as I opened it up, which is obviously irritating and a bit frustrating. Now, just like any products, I will say they gave me a good amount of paint and this was the only one that happened on. So maybe that plastic had a little flaw or something. And luckily also with bottled paints, it tends to be that the top of the cap actually creates a good enough seal, so that even if the side is split, the paint itself is actually safe. It's not going to dry out. So I haven't had that issue there. I think it'd be good for them to take a look at improving the quality there to make a more robust cap, because like I say, it doesn't feel too strong to me. But beyond that, it's a good range of metallic paints that are definitely worth having a look at and picking out some to try for your models. Now often when people ask, should I start trying out other brands of paints? Honestly, the time for that is whenever you feel ready for it. You're not going to really know about which paints are better until you start trying them out for yourself. So that can feel a bit intimidating. And that's why sometimes going to sort of a painting course or a painting day where you can go and learn and try out new things can be good, because you can have a bit of guidance there. Because basically, until you've seen how a paint mixes, how it feels to apply to a miniature, and how it looks for yourself with your own eye, it's going to be very hard to really make a judgment on what to buy, what to get, and what you want to use. Most of all, decide whether or not it's going to stay into your regular rotation of paints. So if you do wish to try them out, if you're in the EU, I have provided links for the Turbodork paints. They're available from Exit23Games and also Element Games. If you're in the US, you can buy them from the Turbodork website itself. All the links are in the video description directly below. Now, we'll just make another mention about Element Games here, because I'm not sponsored by Element Games, but I am an affiliate of them. And you'll be able to get Games Workshop products, all the paints you need, all that kind of stuff, for anything like 10 to 15% off your regular prices. But the best thing is, you can also help support me and the channel by purchasing through my affiliate link from Element Games. If you regularly buy your models, especially when some of this new stuff's coming out, please bookmark my affiliate link that is linked in all my videos down below for your future purchases, because it helps support me and the channel. If you get stuff from Element Games, if you're in the EU, every time if you use my link, that's going to help me out. So I super appreciate it. Now, just before you thought I was finished talking about painting stuff, nope, a small word on brushes. Now, I have not talked extensively about brushes before or those that I use. This is ultimately always a personal preference, and some people are always going to maintain that you can do absolutely perfect work with paintbrushes that cost you pennies. I am yet to meet someone who paints at a high end and uses cheap as chips brushes. As with most things, the reality is also that there is never one best brush. Like all creative things, there's no magic tool that is going to just somehow gift you powers that make your painting advance overnight. The only way that happens is with a combination of continual practice and learning processes. With that said, there are gains to be had by choosing the right brush for the right job, and brands do differ. Now, I've been steadily trying a range of brushes to find what works best, and so in this image here, you can see what I primarily use to paint my Indomitus Force. Now obviously, you don't actually need to use this many, you only need a couple of brushes really, but I was experimenting a bit. So starting from the top, these are Rosemary Co Synthetics 313 series. Synthetics behave a little differently to natural hair brushes, and they do have their place. They also can be used with harsher chemicals than a natural brush without fear of damaging them. This 313 series though, I really do love. They didn't cost very much and the handles are very comfortable. The bristles keep their point as well, and I found them to be a very practical bristle dimension. Then next we have the Winsor & Newton Series 7. These are very well regarded by most painters. They're an expensive brush, and while most people will say that these are their default, I've seen others say that they've had bad luck with them splitting and so on. I think that's definitely in the minority. I've had these for quite some time, and with good brush care, using some brush soap with natural hair bristles, so ensuring you don't leave paint as well caked into the base of the bristles. You should never do that with any brush. They should last and last. They've got a very fine quality, their dimensions and their point always clean, and you can get great control. Then we have Raphael. Now these are some brushes that I've had people asking me a lot recently, have you tried them? So I decided I'd pick up a size 0, 1 and 2, it's pretty standard. I found I used the 0 in this range the most, keeps its point very nicely, holds a good amount of paint in the bristles. I'd say it's a very solid multi-purpose brush, as you could really use it from start to finish on a Mini if you chose to. I tend to switch around between brushes myself depending on which part of a Mini I'm painting and how I'm painting, but this I think could serve very well as a good general painter. Then lastly we have the Artis Opus brushes. Now I should note, these were sent to me for free to test out, just like the Turbodork paints. The Artis Opus brushes that I've been using for some time though were both the Series M and Series D. Now you can probably see that the Series M brushes sized 1 and 2 in the image are shorter bristle length than the other brushes you can see. This is very much by design, and you'll see other brands as well offer brushes of this differing bristle length as well. The reason for this is that sometimes you want to have more control. And so when you have those shorter bristles, it means that when you press down on the brush, it's not going to spread out so much. And this is why I keep these guys in my regular rotation, as sometimes I need to apply paint in a specific level of control, and they enable me to do this. It's all about having options in your brush toolbox. That's why when I look at my painting table, I have a stack of, 20 brushes there that I will pick and choose from depending on what I'm doing. And then lastly you got the Artis Opus Series D, and this is their dry brush range. Now you can always make a dry brush out of some cheapo brushes, and I've done this before. The problem is they tend to just then disintegrate, because dry brushing is quite a harsh process and they take a beating. When you dry brush, you're flicking bristles in all directions. You're usually doing that pretty roughly because you don't have a lot of paint on a brush when you're dry brushing, so you need to get it off as much as possible, and that's very tough on the brush. With the Series D, I painted all of the Indomitus bases, several rounds of dry brushing. I used them already on multiple squads before that, and as you can probably see, they're in near enough still perfect condition. They haven't really lost any bristles that I've noticed. In truth, I was very skeptical about the Series D when I received them, because I was like, okay, fancy dry brushes, because I've always thought of dry brushes as being something of a crappy throwaway tool, not a fine tool like a normal painting brush. And I think I was wrong about that, because I try hard to take good care of these dry brushes, and by just giving them a smoosh in the brush soap, getting that excess paint off and then another swish in the soap, they've stayed in near enough new quality since I got them last year. So big fan of these actually now, and I would recommend trying them out. I do think you will see the benefit of it. So that's the brushes. I will talk about this further when I come to doing a dedicated painting video, which is in the pipeline. Now then, just before we look at the Necrons, I want to throw in here this, which was my colour test for the Sisters of Battle force that I have in the pipeline. Now this force is going to be related to the Lutin Necropolis, and I know many of you have wanted me to write some more stuff for that. I will do. And I wanted their armour for the Sisters here to be a rose gold scheme. Not that easy to do. I achieved this by doing a base layer of silver on the Mini, and then I used a pearlescent colour paint over the top. I then washed this with sepia. It does need a little more contrast in some areas I think, but overall this was about as close as I could get, and I tried it a few different ways. I was happy with this. Now I should note that this is an original metal Sister of Battle, so the quality of the miniature is not as high, but I think on the new minis, because they're much cleaner, more stark and crisp, it's going to look even more clear and a higher quality finish. So I'm very much looking forward to getting started on that, and that's going to be something which is upcoming. Now also on the go, I have an infantry force of, I've got so much on the go. I've also got an infantry force of Imperial Guard. These were meant to be a strike force to accompany the Ultramarines, so they're supposed to be Imperial Guard from within the Ultramar system itself. So they're kind of part and parcel of the Ultramarines in general. So these guardsmen will hail from the home planet of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, which is mostly my force, of Talasar. This guard force consists of some 5 veteran guard squads, 2 squads of Scions, a penal conscript squad, and a command squad. And these are going to be supported by a Valkyrie. Also, most of my Imperial Guard are actually Forge Worlds with respirators and special environment suits, which makes them look even more veteran and special. There's also going to be a Lehman Russ squad of 3 tanks and a command tank to support. So this should be a really interesting little side project to complete, and hopefully as I have the colour scheme that you can see nailed down, when I come to paint this, it should be quite straightforward. So both of these forces are going to be steadily underway somehow by myself, and you're going to be seeing more of those in the future. Hopefully, given the painting schemes that I have come up with, these will be a little bit quicker to smash through than the Ultras, but we will see about that by this time next year when I've only gotten 2 squads finished. So now finally we come to my new force, the Necrons of the Indomitus box set. Now, I am of course well aware that the Necrons were coming up as one of the forces that Games Workshop are redoing and that they're smashing out new minis for. And a medium-sized part of me originally didn't want to jump on the Necron bandwagon. However, I already have a vintage Eldar and Chaos Force that are just languishing in my purgatory of miniature shame, and while they wait for me to have a burst of inspiration where I decide what to do with them, 2 armies that have sat unfinished by me in a worrying period of some 20 years, I decided that if I was going to go in on a new force, why the hell not stop fretting about who else is going to get in on the action? I wanted to just gift myself the joy of having a non-Space Marine army that is going to be getting some actual new models, which is rare these days. Plus, on the sly, I do actually like the Necron because they have not only an ancient history in the galaxy of 40k that predates most of the other factions, but their own story continues to evolve and develop in really interesting ways. You might say I enjoy their take of aggressive apathy. Yes, I like the Necron on many levels, and despite the detractors, I actually loved the new Indomitus animations that came with that release. Seeing those guardsmen boost each other's courage up, only to then immediately have their faces disintegrated by Gorse weapons, whilst one guardsman is looking on, was truly glorious. Plus, then just talking about building a Necron army, you've got hilarious characters like Trazin the Infinite, who we can only pray has a new mini coming in the pipeline, Illuminor Zeras, which of course did not come with the Indomitus set, but that I had to include from day one here in the Force, because how could you not? I think Illuminor Zeras is probably one of the best miniatures that is out there now. I think it's better looking than a new Void Dragon Catan. Is it better than the Silent King? Maybe not. So also, yeah, we do have the Silent King, the Void Dragon Catan Shard, Hexmark Destroyers, new monoliths and more. I am unashamedly on the Necron bandwagon, and I'm loving it. It's kind of scarily crept up on me though that through the past 20 years, I somehow now have acquired about 5 40k armies, granted all in various states of unfinishedness. And so as we're getting towards the end of this year and the Ultramarines are doing very well, I think this has got to be the goal for 2021. To get, if not one, then several forces to a state of finishedness. My Ultramarines are not that far off. The Necron, thanks to Siege Studios, will be easier to get on top of, and once I get the sisters rolling, I'm hopeful that that's going to go pretty smoothly. Now, keeping all of this in mind, I was very well aware when we got to the Indomitus stuff just how much I had going on in terms of doing videos here, also trying to steadily paint up my forces, and I'd set myself some fairly high standards these days of what I want to do with my own miniature painting, so that means I don't get them smashed out that quick. A standard Space Marine squad can take for me at least a week. So the big problem for me in choosing a Necron force was how on earth was I going to get them finished whilst also trying to complete my ultras, bearing in mind other stuff was going on as well. It's taken me 2 months to get the Indomitus Marines done. Now, I had never commissioned anything other than singular characters in the past, because you may remember that Siege painted up an awesome Inquisitor Eisenhorn for me a little while ago. But doing this Necron battle force was something pretty different, and I thought I would take the opportunity today to also talk a little bit about commission painting in general, to try and just better lay out for you guys how it functions. Now, the very obvious burning question, what does it cost to have a whole force painted up? And the problem with that is that Siege Studios will always quote you based on the specifics of your order. So in my case, for example, I was not asking for just a basic paint scheme. Not to mention Siege's base quality level of bronze is already above what is considered tabletop ready in the industry. So my specifications for this Necron force were that I required a custom color combination. So even my infantry for this force would require lots of specific shading and detailing, which is above what most infantry are going to be having. And this means that my force will obviously very likely cost much more than might yours for those same models. Now, I also had various units at different qualities, and I also asked for specific other detailing on, say, the bases and weathering elements for them. And then you've got the glows from the energy aspects of Necron weapons and so on. I think what some people don't always realize is that professional miniature painting is not some just on the side bedroom business. There are people who do it for themselves out of their own home, but it is actually a trade. Just because you don't go to study a qualification for it, it's a skilled trade. Siege Studios is a professional industry business. So back to my original point, if you're thinking that you could get a whole force painted up for a few $100s, the answer is no. It's more likely that you would get one large character done. Commission painting at any level is expensive. And why? It's because you're paying for a very skilled painter to spend tens, if not hundreds even, of hours depending on the project. You're going to ask them to build and paint your miniatures to a very high standard. You're paying for their skill, their time, as you would with any skilled person in any trade. And just like most things in life, you get what you pay for. And if you can get something done considerably cheaper, the answer to that is you probably shouldn't be able to. And I've often seen people say, well, who would pay for commissioned forces? One might say, well, who would pay out for a professional upholsterer or indeed any master craftsman? The people who pay for it are the people who know that they want to get quality. They want to be assured that they will get quality. And so they're going to go to the people that are able to deliver it. The truth is that I myself, I actually prefer to paint up my own models because I greatly enjoy painting. I really wanted to paint up that Necron force because, like I recently said in my other video about what you can get out of painting, it's greatly enjoyable, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to paint my Necrons, and if I could spend all my time painting, then I would do that, but other things get in the way. Similarly, there are other YouTube channels like Tabletop Tactics, SM Battle Reports, Mini Wargaming. They're not necessarily going to have the time to get all their armies done at their own hand. And this is why all of these channels are also affiliated with Siege Studios, because they use them to enable what they do. That's kind of what I had to do. I simply do not have the time to paint up that entire force, and that's why you go to commission painting. You might also have somebody who simply wants just to have one character, like their favorite. Imagine you've read all the Horus Heresy books. You want to have one character there painted up really well to a high standard. And I've seen many of you guys in the comments actually saying before this, I want to buy this character, I want to have that character, but they don't want to shell out all the kit, all the brushes, all the paints, all the stuff you need to paint up that one model. Plus as well, of course, going through how to learn to paint and all that other stuff. They don't want to do any of that. They just want a beautiful model to put up on a shelf. Totally understandable. And again, that's where commissions come in. So if you asked me, is this a niche thing? I'd say yes, probably right. But at the same time, it certainly isn't that niche because most commissioned studios are booked solid and have a decent waiting list, which pretty much is just ongoing. Siege, in fact, are currently looking for new painters because they want to expand. And just in general, I've seen some independent painters taking on huge projects. So there's definitely no shortage at all of people wanting commission painting because there weren't people who didn't want the service. It simply wouldn't exist as a thing in general. Siege also showcase everything they produce on their YouTube channel, their link in the video description below. They showcase the majority of commissions they produce, and so you will, for example, see my Necron force there. The good thing about showing off the produced miniatures in this way, where they look at every single model and you just go check it out, is that you can see up close without any photoshopping exactly how the miniatures look. You can see that they're painted by Siege, and if you check out their channel, you can also get an inspiration for your own forces and color combinations to try out. And I'll just finish by saying I've also been very pleased to see that quite a few of you guys have already also used Siege and shared the results to myself. I'm always glad to see people enjoying their finished miniatures within their armies. So now, what was the result of all that? Well, when it came to my Necron force, the results absolutely speak for themselves. And I can tell you, I was in fact so happy with the results here that I've asked Siege to do some more for me to add to this force. So soon I'm going to be adding another squad of warriors, 3 Lockhurst destroyers and a Triarch Stalker, which I am considerably excited to see finished. I'm also going to have some magnetization going on. And the first thing people ask about my Necron force is which dynasty are they going to be? Well, unsurprisingly, they're going to be a custom dynasty. Now, I will be detailing a separate video to talk about their backstory because I haven't finished putting it all together yet, but in brief, they're going to be known as the Zotek dynasty. And these were one of the later Necron dynasties to awaken, but they have been aggressive toward all around them, raiding both Imperial and Xenos worlds, exterminating all that they encounter. They seek collaboration and unity with other Necron as their cryptics believe that the time approaches when the Necron are going to need to come together once again. And the Zotek dynastic markings, the colours, reflect their Pharaon's guidance and outlook, and as such their living metal takes on a furious orange hue similar to the Mefrit, but it also has a cyan gradation to reflect the balance they seek to achieve between destruction and constructive research. Their ultimate goal is to regain some sense of culture. So scouring the galaxy of any who are not Necron in a crusade of vengeance may be simplistic enough for some other dynasties, but this is not rewarding or worthwhile for the Zotek in and of itself. Already on their adjacent worlds and systems, Pharaon Zokanet has begun ambitious construction of new temples and tomb complexes, as well as research cryptic tombs for what he sees as the reawakening, not only their dynasty, but indeed their race at large. It is said that the core tomb world of Zumvok has been turned into less of a tomb and more akin to a planetary battle station, not entirely dissimilar to the Borsis world engine. However, whereas the Borsis engine was designed to be a planetary-sized weapon, it was a Necron planetary-sized weapon, the Zumvok Tomb World is more like an armed planetary station. It's heavily fortified with unnumbered quantities of Gorse projectors and scores of Doom and Night scythes. They likely have teleporting technology as well, similar to the World engine, able to transport large objects from one location into another, which could also be used obviously for offensive purposes, trying to make two objects exist in the same space in time. So with that brief background in mind, I wanted this Dynasty colour to be as described, not a standard grey and green, but I decided on this distinctive blue-green versus orange gradient for the Dynasty. And I think Siege have managed to produce one of the best looking Necron forces I have seen. The standard green energy metal Necron look is undoubtedly a powerful colour combination. Another option people regularly go toward is a rusted look for Necron. Now I can understand why you would go for that, because who doesn't love a shambling robotic looking enemy force covered in heavy corrosion? It's a beautiful thing. But for me, I couldn't live with it, because it makes absolutely no sense. Necrons don't rust, they're made of living metal. So as someone who is fairly invested in the lore, I couldn't look at that every day. It would drive me crazy, so no rust on my Necrons. Instead I opted for this look, and after carefully considering if it was going to be attempted using one of the pearlescent style paints, which I really looked at hard across a range of different companies including Turbodork, or just done with standard paints, we decided to do the latter, because it would probably be easier to replicate this down the road. Imagine if you paint your whole army in a specialist paint, and then they later stop making that paint, which is a very high likelihood. You know, these paints, they don't stick around forever. That's a worrying thing, because then you kind of can't create that force anymore, or you have to make some bastardized version of it. So I decided no, we'll just stick with standard paints, because that's going to be easier to make down the road. Also, just using standard paints, you're likely to have less weird incidents or unpredictable outcomes. It's going to be more standard, it's going to be more applicable across any miniatures and as it comes, because you can adapt it, you can make it work. When you have a very specific paint which behaves in a very specific way, you're kind of limited, you know, it only does what it does. Whereas if you're just using other paints, you can adapt and tweak and push it a bit to make it look better or whatever you want to do on individual models. Plus, on top of that, I need to be able to paint some of these myself, so it couldn't be too specialized of a scheme, even though it kind of already was. But essentially, I had to keep it within the realm of what I was going to be able to do myself. So then let's come to talk about the models. The army, like I said, it speaks for itself. It's just awesome to look at. No surprise that Illuminor Xeras is the standout model of the entire force. It's already an amazing, epic miniature. It's huge on the table, but look, it's also beautiful work of art at the same time. It just looks amazing. The new Necron warriors are on the other end of the scale. They're simple but well executed. They're nicely consistent. I equipped them all with the Gorse Reaper and plan to keep all my warriors with those. Their job is going to be just getting over the table, moving in, dealing damage. Long range shots, you can leave that for other units. We have the Scorpec Destroyers, which I truly love as well, mainly for their animated poses, but the huge sweeping blades, you can just imagine them cleaving their way through Imperial Guard troops, leaving nothing but gibbering piles of lacerated flesh and a ground awash with blood. It's a beautiful model, I love it. The Plasmancer and Cryptothralls, they're really alien looking. You can imagine the Plasmancer, I think, moving like a ghost with it hovering above the ground there. It's got this hanging living metal cloak. The Plasmancers, they simply wield energy in its purest form. They don't need to bind it into another form like lower beings do with their crude weapons. They just use raw energy. We've got the Necron Overlord and Royal Warden, and again, these are just solid minis in this army. The pose for the Necron Overlord is really strong, and the painting that Siege did on him is absolutely awesome. Really do love this model. Even though I included Xeras in this army, I would be absolutely fine with this guy leading the fight just as well, because he carries a real presence. The Warden as well definitely fits that role. He looks absolutely solid. And then we've got another absolutely huge model, the Scorpec Lord. This model is simply massive. It really towers over all the others, and seeing this on the battlefield in close quarters is going to be a beautiful thing. Again, this painting from Siege really speaks for itself. I mean, just look at it. What more can I really say? It is absolutely beautiful. They smashed this out of the park with the gradiated color scheme, the highlighted silvers, the glow, the blends on the energy weapons. Now, as I said earlier, you can see just how much painting work is in each of these guys. Necrons are usually pretty fast to smash out of a force because it's just a prime, base coat, bit of highlights, glow, you're done. My infantry had several more steps in order to achieve the gradiated tone on their armor. However, I truly think that extra effort there is worth it, because look at the results. These look more than just anonymous drone-like infantry. They have more of a character and a presence to them, and that is something that I think has been achieved through the whole army, and it somewhat ties into the kind of lore stuff, my homebrew imagined lore that I want to apply to these guys. Overall, the Necron Force, the Space Marines together, it's been a big project these past 2 months and it has come together with great success. I genuinely couldn't be more happy with how both of these forces have turned out, and the Necrons have formed a very solid base to start the army off with. Like I said, Siege will be working on a couple more bits for me, but I also will be attempting to see if I can paint up some myself in this scheme, because finding the actual time to do it though, that's the thing that's going to be the more difficult part. Now, if you want to get a quote on a painting project for yourself, go check out Siege Studios' website at siegestudios.co.uk. The link is with all the links in the video description. Now, as I have noted previously, Siege also hosts live painting events, and I've said before just how helpful that was for my own painting progression. In fact, I did enjoy the first course that I'd gone on so much, I gifted a friend of mine a weekend for it last year for him to do as well, because I really do think it's that worthwhile. I'll also just note that if you're in the US, Siege will ship internationally, so if you want to use their services, they regularly do projects for international clients as well as those in the UK and Europe. So what else will I be adding to this Necron force? Well, very obviously I wanted to wait and see the Codex, and I'll finish by mentioning about the new books as well in a moment, but I will, as mentioned earlier, be adding some Locust Destroyers, which I have magnetized myself, as you can see here, and let me tell you, getting that done was a royal pain in the ass. I'll probably talk about magnetization at some point, but it will allow me to switch out their weapons there, which I wanted. I'll also be adding to the Necron army some Hexmark Destroyers, the Silent King, the Void Dragon Shard, Deathmarks, 2 squads of Immortals, a Doomstalker, a new Monolith, some Ophidian Destroyers, and finally a Tesseract Vault. So yes, the future is looking full of oblivion, and we should be scouring the worlds of man. Now, as you guys well know, I am not a 40k battle or rules channel. Although I know there are probably those of you who would love for me to dive in on that stuff, it's just not my main focus, and likely a lot of people on the channel wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about as well. But just for today, I wanted to make the most notable observations that I've had with these codexes. As you might imagine, I have a fairly substantial collection of 40k books over the years, and one of the things that has irritated me in the past, and with the 8th edition codexes, was something quite intangible, I guess, and I think I've really drilled it down to being about the data listings. I could tell straight away how different this was with the 9th versions, because they're much cleaner. They have reorganized some of the listings so they make a bit more logical sense, like for example, organizing the HQ so they're listed together by role instead of armor type, which always was insanely annoyingly stupid previously. Now it makes more sense. Everybody should know by now that in terms of content, codexes, they don't change much. In fact, some of the codex in terms of raw lore information have actually barely changed since 2nd edition. That's not really why people buy new codex. The lore stuff in codex is there for newcomers to 40k, because most of the rich lore is now in the books and supplements and usually rule books, I guess. I will say, of course, sometimes they do add little details, which is why we end up trawling through them, trying to find some meaning or inferences which have been switched up and tweaked, or perhaps just providing some extra clarity in a timeline. But the main reason for codexes is very obviously their new data for units, which people need for playing. But in order for them to function well, getting that data needs to be really nice and clear. And this is why, for example, when we come to the points lists at the end of the codex, they actually have now page references listed next to the units. It's such a simple thing, but very helpful when you're trying to find something quickly. And this is what I mean when I say I love these codex. They haven't changed much around in any fundamental way, because 40k codexes rarely do. It's just the next iteration of factional data and rules packaged up nicely. But in these codex, they have tweaked them to be a little bit more user-friendly, cleaner layouts, more logical arrangements, page referencing. It's just small things, but the small things make a big difference over the lifetime of a book that you're going to use likely with some regularity. So I really like these. The lore stuff in them, there's some nice maps, beautiful images. Again, I appreciate them just as books, because as you guys remember when I did the last sort of update video and I was talking about the Frail Stern stuff, and I was saying I like to buy stuff just to have the beautiful things. I like to look at stuff like that. I appreciate the art and I appreciate the look and the stylization of stuff like this, but in terms of the functionality, they work well, they work nicely, and that is the main thing that I like with these new codex. So that is all for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this considerably longer video than I expected it was going to be. That was the full Indomitus Force, my breakdown of the painting used, some previews and overviews. We will of course be back to the lore next. Will it be Titans? Will it be Assassins? Will it be weapons? Will it be something else? We will see. but I will have also more hobby and painting related stuff along the way soon. Thanks to you all very much for watching. As always, stay safe out there in our crazy world. If you enjoyed, drop a like, it helps me out, and consider watching back through my playlist of modeling videos. I've linked that as well at the end of this video if you want to see some of the models and stuff that I have painted up before, including my Repulsor Executioner, which I think is possibly one of the best models I have painted. So if you have some time today, please take a little look, watch that one through. As always, I'll see you all in the next one.